I promised never to hand him my heir, until the night I picked his son above my life. In the heart of the capital, the palace stood like a dark jewel, gleaming under the quiet night. Within its walls, the air was thick with whispers, stories of kings and queens, of curses long forgotten, and of a power that could both save and destroy. Lady Seraphine moved quietly through the corridor, her footsteps echoing softly against the cold stone. She was the heir to Eldrath, a girl born into duty, raised to serve her kingdom before herself. Her dark hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, and her emerald eyes shone with a mixture of resolve and sorrow. She had made a promise, one that had shaped her entire life. She would never give her hand or her heir to King Valerian. Valerian was a man both feared and admired. His presence commanded attention, even from those who sought to hide from him. The stories of his deeds were told in hushed tones. Some spoke of his cunning, others of his cruelty. Yet beyond the crown and the fear, there was a strange sadness about him, a weight he carried that none could understand. He had a son, Prince Kael, a boy of unusual power and quiet intensity, whom Valerian had kept distant from the court, fearing the boy's own abilities. Tonight, the grand hall was alive with music and laughter. Candles flickered along the walls, their flames dancing in rhythm with the harpist's song. Nobles in shimmering gowns and embroidered tunics spoke in polite tones, their eyes constantly flicking toward the throne where Valerian sat, a shadow of a king among them. Seraphine had come not to entertain, but to observe, to uphold her duty while keeping her oath intact. She barely noticed the guests around her, for her gaze was fixed on the boy. Kael moved through the crowd with a grace that seemed almost unnatural, his dark hair falling in waves that mirrored his father's, his eyes a deep, stormy gray that seemed to look into places one would rather keep hidden. There was something in him that drew Seraphine's attention, something she could not explain. The music shifted, and Valerian rose from his throne. His voice, deep and commanding, silenced the room immediately. "Tonight," he said, "we celebrate the kingdom's strength, its history, and its future." His eyes swept across the hall, landing briefly on Seraphine. She felt a chill, as though his gaze had reached through the crowd and touched her very soul. Kael, standing slightly behind his father, looked at her as well. There was recognition there, a spark that neither boy nor girl understood yet, a connection that seemed older than their years. Seraphine felt her pulse quicken. She reminded herself of her promise, the oath she had taken with the crown as witness. She would never give herself or her child to Valerian. Never. But the night had its own plans. A sudden commotion broke through the celebration. A servant, pale and trembling, rushed into the hall. "Your Grace, the northern gate," the words stumbled and fell, but the fear in the boy's eyes was enough. Valerian's expression hardened instantly. Without a word, he moved toward the gate, Kael following closely behind. Seraphine's instincts urged her to go as well, though she was unsure why. The northern gate opened to reveal a figure shrouded in black. Shadows seemed to cling to him, and the air around him shimmered with dark energy. Valerian stepped forward, his presence radiating authority. The figure laughed softly, a sound like dry leaves brushing against stone. "You cannot protect him, King," the voice whispered. Kael stepped forward, his hand glowing faintly with a silver light. Seraphine gasped. She had seen magic before in books and in legends, but never like this. The boy's power was raw and uncontrolled, yet beautiful in its intensity. "Step back, Kael," Valerian commanded, his voice low but firm. The boy hesitated, then reluctantly lowered his hand. The shadowy figure's eyes gleamed. "He is stronger than you think, stronger than you ever imagined." Seraphine felt a strange pull toward the boy. It was not fear nor pity, but something more complex, something that twisted deep inside her chest. She could see the boy's loneliness, the weight of expectation, the fear of the power he did not yet understand. And for a moment, she wondered if her oath was meant to protect him, or to protect herself from a destiny she could not yet face. The shadow figure vanished as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving only a whisper. The choice is coming. Choose or lose everything. The hall fell silent, the music and laughter extinguished as if they had never existed. Valerian's eyes found Seraphine's, and for a moment she saw not the king but the man, a man who had suffered, who had loved and lost, who carried a darkness he could not fully escape. "Come," he said finally, turning to leave. Cale followed, his steps uncertain. Seraphine hesitated, torn between her oath and the pull she could not name. Finally, she moved after them, her heart beating in rhythm with the shadows around her. They entered the courtyard, the moonlight casting long, sharp shadows across the stones. Valerian paused, looking at Cale. "You must learn control," he said softly. "The power within you can protect or destroy. You choose." Cale nodded, though his hands trembled. Seraphine stepped closer, feeling a sudden surge of protectiveness she could not explain. She did not know the boy, and yet she felt as if she had known him all her life. That night, as the palace slept, Seraphine found herself standing near Cale's chamber. She could hear his soft breathing, even from outside the door. She thought of the oath she had taken, the promise she had made, and she realized with a mixture of fear and longing that this promise might not be enough. The next morning, the city awoke to rumors of the shadow figure and the boy's unusual powers. Nobles whispered about Valerian's rule, his strength, and the boy who might one day surpass him. Seraphine kept her distance, yet her thoughts were never far from Cale. She wondered what it meant to protect someone else's life above her own, what it meant to risk everything for a child she barely knew. Days passed, and Cale grew restless, wandering the palace gardens alone. Seraphine followed at a distance, watching him from behind columns and trees. One afternoon she finally approached him. "You should not wander alone," she said softly. Cale turned, his gray eyes wary yet curious. "And who are you to say that?" "I am someone who cares," Seraphine replied, her voice trembling slightly. She did not want to admit the truth, that she cared for him more than she should, that the oath she had taken was beginning to feel like a chain. Cale studied her for a long moment. "You are different from the others," he said finally. "You do not fear me." "I do not fear what I do not understand," Seraphine said, "and I wish to understand." For the first time, Cale smiled, a small, hesitant thing. "Then perhaps we will help each other," he said. Even as the sun set behind the palace towers, casting golden light across the gardens, neither of them spoke of the danger still lurking in the shadows. The shadow figure had not been gone entirely. His warning lingered, like a cold wind brushing against the walls of their hearts. Seraphine returned to her chambers that evening, her thoughts heavy. She knew the choice was coming, though she did not yet know what form it would take. She had promised never to hand herself, or her heir to Valerian, and yet, standing beside Cale, she felt the first stirrings of a connection she could not deny. That night as the moon climbed higher, Seraphine dreamed of fire and shadow, of a boy with eyes like storms, and a man whose hands could either destroy or save her. She awoke with a start, the memory of a whisper lingering in her mind. Choose him or lose everything. The palace was quiet, but Seraphine's heart was not. She knew that the path before her would demand courage and perhaps sacrifice. She did not yet understand how the threads of fate were weaving around her, binding her to a boy she barely knew, to a king she had vowed to resist. But one thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. Outside, the wind howled through the towers, carrying with it the faintest trace of shadow. The choice was coming, and Seraphine felt it deep in her bones. And though she did not yet know what she would choose, she knew that the night would never let her rest again. For in the world of Eldrath, power and love were never separate. And in that collision of heart and destiny, Seraphine, Cale, and Valerian were bound together, whether they wished it or feared it. The night whispered, and Seraphine listened, knowing that the broken oath she had taken might not be enough to save them all. The forest of Nithra stretched endlessly, its ancient trees standing like silent sentinels under a silvered sky. Shadows clung to every branch, twisting with the wind, and the air carried whispers that seemed older than time itself. Lady Seraphine moved carefully, her cloak brushing against moss and fallen leaves, each step echoing softly in the stillness. Beside her walked Kale, his gray eyes scanning the dim light, alert and tense. It had been days since the shadow figure had appeared at the northern gate of the palace. The encounter had left both Seraphine and Kale uneasy, their hearts weighed down by fear and questions they could not answer. Seraphine had insisted on taking Kale away from the court, believing that the boy's power was too dangerous and uncontrolled to remain under the palace's watchful eyes. And Kale, though wary, had followed her, trusting her in ways he had never trusted his own father. The forest was alive with a strange energy, one that made Seraphine shiver. The legends spoke of Nithra as a place where time bent and memories lingered, where magic and shadow walked side by side. It was said that anyone who entered the forest without understanding its secrets would lose themselves to the darkness. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Kale asked, his voice low but steady. He carried himself with a cautious confidence, yet Seraphine noticed the tension in his shoulders. The boy was not used to relying on anyone, yet here he was, walking beside her as though she were the only one who could guide him. "Yes," Seraphine replied softly, though even she was uncertain. "The forest tests those who enter it. If we are careful, it can also show us what we need to see." Kale glanced at her, and for a moment there was an understanding between them that needed no words. They were both bound by a sense of destiny, though neither knew exactly what path awaited them. The deeper they moved into Nithra, the heavier the air became. Shadows stretched and twisted, forming shapes that seemed almost human. Seraphine's heart quickened. She had always known the forest held secrets, but she had not expected to feel watched at every turn. Kale's hand trembled slightly as he brushed against the bark of a tree, his power reacting to the strange energy around them. "You feel it too," he said quietly, almost to himself. Seraphine nodded. "It's alive, but it is not evil, not yet," Kale frowned. "Not yet. The forest holds mirrors," she explained. "It reflects what is inside us, our fears, our desires, our truths. It will not harm you unless you give it permission." Kale's eyes darkened as he considered her words. "Then what if I am afraid?" Seraphine stopped and turned to him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Then you must be braver than your fear. The forest will challenge you, yes, but it can also teach you. You must decide what kind of power you want to hold, not just what others want from you." They continued walking, the silence between them deepening, filled with unspoken questions and thoughts too heavy for words. The shadows seemed to swirl around them, moving with a life of their own. Seraphine felt a strange pull, as though the forest were drawing her toward something she was meant to see. After what felt like hours, they reached a small clearing. Moonlight poured down through the branches, illuminating a pool of water so still it seemed like glass. Seraphine knelt beside it, her reflection shimmering on the surface, and then looked at Kale. "This is a place of truth," she said. "Look into the water. It will show you what is hidden inside your heart." Kale stepped forward hesitantly, his reflection wavering in the silvered light. As he stared, the water began to ripple and his reflection shifted. He saw himself not as a boy but as a man of immense power, his eyes glowing with silver light and shadows stretching around him like a cloak. He stumbled back, overwhelmed by the vision. I do not want that," he whispered. "I do not want to be feared." Seraphine placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You do not have to be feared, but you cannot hide from who you are. Power is not meant to be ignored. It is meant to be understood, controlled, and sometimes shared." Kale's eyes met hers, and for the first time he allowed himself to trust her completely. "And if I fail?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Then we face the consequences together," Seraphine replied firmly. "You are not alone, Kale, you never have been." The boy's hands glowed faintly as he absorbed her words, his power reacting to the encouragement and trust she offered. The shadows around them seemed to hesitate, as though acknowledging the bond forming between them. They spent the night in the clearing, resting beside the pool, the forest around them alive with quiet whispers. Seraphine taught Kale how to focus his power, to calm it when it surged uncontrollably, and to listen to the magic that ran through him like a river. Kale, in turn, shared his fears, his loneliness, and the burden of being the son of a king who had demanded so much from him without understanding. By morning, a fragile trust had formed between them, one built on shared struggle and mutual care. Kale no longer looked at her with suspicion but with a quiet reverence, as though she had become the anchor in a storm he did not yet understand. But the forest had not finished its lessons. As they prepared to leave the clearing, a figure emerged from the shadows. Seraphine instinctively moved in front of Kale, her hand resting on the hilt of a dagger she had kept at her side. The figure was cloaked in black, and even in the dim light, Seraphine could feel the pulse of power radiating from it. "You have come far," the figure said, its voice a low whisper that seemed to echo through the trees. "But the choice is coming. You cannot run from fate, nor from the shadows that follow you." Kale stepped forward, his hands glowing as he prepared to defend them. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice strong despite the fear in his eyes. The figure laughed softly, a sound like dry leaves brushing against stone. "I am a messenger," it said, "a guide, but beware, not all guidance is safe. Some truths will wound you more than any battle." Seraphine's eyes narrowed. "What do you want from us?" "To see if you are ready," the figure replied. "Ready to face the power you hold, ready to make the choices that will bind or break you. The boy is the key. And you, the girl, are already entangled in what is to come." With that, the figure vanished, leaving only a faint trace of shadow and a cold wind that brushed against their faces. Seraphine and Kale exchanged a glance, both understanding that the forest had revealed only the beginning of the challenges ahead. The journey back to the palace was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Seraphine's mind replayed the shadow figure's words. She felt a deep unease, a premonition that the danger was closer than she had imagined. And yet, she could not deny the connection she felt with Kale, nor the responsibility she had taken upon herself to protect him. As they neared the palace gates, the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, casting golden light over the stones. Kale slowed, looking up at the towers with a mixture of awe and apprehension. "The court, it will not understand me," he murmured. "They will never understand what you truly are," Seraphine said softly. "But that does not matter. What matters is that you understand yourself, and that you know you are not alone." Kale nodded, a small smile breaking through the tension in his face. "Then I will trust you," he said, "even if I do not fully understand the path ahead." Seraphine felt a warmth in her chest at his words, a fragile hope that perhaps they could face whatever darkness awaited them together. But the shadow figure's warning lingered, a cold reminder that the world of Eldrath was not kind to those who held power without understanding it. That night, as they rested in a small chamber near the palace, Seraphine watched Kale sleep. She thought of her oath, of the promise she had made to never hand her heir to Valyrian, and she felt the first stirrings of doubt. Her heart tugged in directions she did not yet fully comprehend, and she realized that protecting Kale might mean defying everything she had believed about duty, loyalty, and fate. Outside, the forest of Nithera whispered in the wind, as though carrying messages from beyond the mortal world. Seraphine knew that the journey ahead would demand courage, sacrifice, and a willingness to face not only the shadows outside but the shadows within themselves. And she also knew, deep in her heart, that nothing would ever be the same again. Kale's fate, her own, and perhaps even Valyrian's, were now intertwined in ways none of them could yet understand. The first threads of a bond had been woven, fragile but unbreakable, and the choices they would make next could either save them all or tear them apart. The night stretched on, dark and full of promise, and Seraphine listened to the wind as it whispered through the towers. The shadow figure's words echoed in her mind. The choice is coming. You cannot run from fate. And she knew that soon, the forest's lessons would demand more than courage. They would demand the truth of their hearts. The palace of Eldrath was no longer the place of quiet whispers and golden halls that Seraphine had known. Shadows stretched along the walls, creeping with every flicker of candlelight. The northern wind carried the scent of storms and distant fires, as if the kingdom itself had begun to shift under the weight of coming events. Seraphine walked cautiously through the corridors, Kale at her side, and yet a strange tension hung in the air. Valerian had returned from a journey through the outer provinces, where unrest had begun to stir among the lords. The king's presence was heavier than before. His eyes held storms Seraphine could not yet read, and the aura around him was stronger, darker, yet tinged with something fragile. Kale stayed close to her, his small hand brushing against hers, seeking reassurance she could barely give. The tension between father, son, and protector was a silent song that echoed in every corner of the palace. Valerian did not speak to Seraphine directly at first, but his gaze followed her, measured and calculating. He had always known she had a connection to Kale, though he had underestimated its depth. Now he could feel it pulling at the edges of his control, forcing him to confront truths he had long buried. Kale, for his part, was growing restless. His powers had become harder to control, and the palace, filled with courtly expectations and veiled threats, was suffocating him. He longed for the clarity of the forest, the silvered moonlight reflecting in quiet pools, where he had first begun to understand himself. Seraphine had been his anchor there, but here, among walls of stone and whispers, he felt trapped. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the towers in gold and shadow, Valerian summoned Seraphine to the throne room. She entered cautiously, aware of the tension that seemed to thrum in the air. Valerian sat upon his throne, the crown heavy on his brow, yet his eyes were not the eyes of a king. They were the eyes of a man who had known loss and betrayal, who had wielded power as both shield and weapon. "You have brought him here," Valerian said, his voice calm but edged with steel. He gestured toward Kale, who stood just behind Seraphine, his hands clenched at his sides. "Do you understand what you have done?" "I understand," Seraphine replied, keeping her voice steady though her heart pounded. "I have protected him, that is all." Valerian studied her for a long moment, his gaze sharp and piercing. Protection is not enough. He cannot survive on instinct alone. He must learn control, discipline, and the truth of who he is. And yet, his voice softened, almost imperceptibly. "I see that you have begun to teach him in ways I could not." Seraphine's pulse quickened. She had not expected admiration, not from Valerian. And yet there it was, hidden beneath the stern command, a flicker of recognition, of understanding. Kale stepped forward, his gray eyes shining in the torchlight. "Father, I am trying," he said. "I am learning. I only need time," and he glanced at Seraphine. "Someone to guide me." Valerian's expression shifted, and for the first time Seraphine saw a crack in the armor he wore so carefully. "Time," he whispered, almost to himself. "Time is a luxury I cannot afford. Yet you have done well, Seraphine. Perhaps better than I could have hoped." The words were both a blessing and a curse. Seraphine felt the weight of their meaning, the subtle acknowledgement that she had begun to influence Kale in ways even the king could not control, and with that influence came danger. For the bond between her and Kale, though pure in intention, was growing stronger, and power in Eldrath was never simple. Days passed, and the tension within the palace intensified. Kale's abilities became more pronounced. Small sparks of silver light would dance at his fingertips, shadows bending slightly around him when he felt strong emotion. Seraphine continued to guide him, helping him channel the energy without fear, teaching him patience, discipline, and the quiet power of restraint. Yet with every lesson came an unspoken question. How much could they trust Valerian? The king's intentions were complex, shadowed by history, pride, and unspoken grief. Seraphine saw it in his eyes, in the way he observed Kale, and in the rare moments when he seemed almost vulnerable, as if the weight of his crown had left him weary and uncertain. One night the three of them stood in the balcony overlooking the city. The moon hung low, painting the stone in silver light. Kale leaned against the railing, his hands glowing faintly as he tested the flow of his power. Seraphine stood behind him, her hand brushing his shoulder in reassurance. Valerian remained silent, standing at a distance, his eyes fixed on the city lights that flickered like fireflies. "Do you ever wonder," Kale said softly, "if the kingdom will ever accept me?" Seraphine glanced at him, her heart tightening. "Perhaps not," she said, "but that does not matter. What matters is that you accept yourself first." Valerian's voice came then, deep and calm. "He speaks the truth. You will face many who fear what you do not yet understand. But strength comes not from their acceptance, but from knowing who you are." Kale looked at his father, a mixture of longing and hesitation in his eyes. "And what if I fail you?" he asked. Valerian stepped closer, his shadow falling over the boy. "Then you will rise again," he said quietly. "Failure is not the end. Only surrender is." The moment lingered, heavy and charged, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between father, son, and protector. Seraphine felt the subtle tension in the air, the delicate balance of trust, power, and care. She realized that she was no longer just a guide for Kale. She was part of a bond that could shift the future of Eldrath itself. But the peace was fragile. The next day, whispers began to spread through the palace like wildfire. Nobles spoke of Kale's powers, of the bond forming between him and Seraphine, and of the subtle changes in Valerian's demeanor. Rumors became accusations, and accusations became demands. Some spoke of fear, others of jealousy, yet all were fueled by the sense that something extraordinary was happening within the palace walls. Seraphine and Kale walked through the gardens in the quiet of the evening, seeking refuge from the growing tension. Kale's hands glowed faintly as he practiced control, the light reflecting in Seraphine's eyes. "Do you think they will ever understand?" he asked quietly. "They will not," Seraphine said, her voice soft but firm. "But it does not matter. What matters is that you understand yourself and that you know you are not alone." Kale looked at her, the shadows of the garden falling across his face, and for the first time he allowed himself to express the depth of his trust. "I do not fear the power anymore," he said. "Not when you are with me." Seraphine's heart ached with a mixture of warmth and sorrow. She could not deny the connection she felt to him, nor the weight of her oath, nor the complexity of her feelings for Valerian, who watched them silently from the palace windows, his thoughts unreadable. The days that followed were filled with lessons, whispered conversations, and subtle power struggles. Kale's abilities grew stronger, and the court's unease became more pronounced. Seraphine found herself in a delicate dance, guiding the boy while navigating the complexities of Valerian's moods, the noble's fears, and the growing sense that destiny was closing around them all like a tightening net. Then one evening, a violent surge of magic shook the palace. Kale had been practicing, testing the limits of his power when the energy spiraled out of control. Shadows stretched across the walls, candles flickered wildly, and a low hum resonated through the stones. Seraphine rushed to his side, her hands reaching out to steady him, to guide the flow of energy, but she felt the raw force of the magic, uncontrolled and unpredictable. Valerian arrived just in time, his own presence adding weight and focus to the room. Together, the three of them formed an unspoken bond of control and trust, channeling the energy and preventing disaster. But the effort was not without cost. Kale collapsed, drained and pale, and Seraphine felt a surge of fear that cut through her resolve. You are stronger than I thought," Valerian said quietly, kneeling beside his son. His voice carried a mixture of pride and worry, the first time Seraphine had heard vulnerability in it. Seraphine pressed her hand to Kale's forehead, feeling the warmth of life still pulsing beneath his skin. "We will protect you," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "We will not let you be consumed by this power." Kale's eyes fluttered open, meeting hers with a faint smile. I trust you," he said softly. The room fell silent, the echoes of magic lingering in the air, and Seraphine realized with a mixture of awe and dread that their fates were now irrevocably linked. They were bound not just by circumstance, but by the choices they had made, the trust they had forged, and the power that flowed between them. As the night settled over the palace, Seraphine stood at the window, looking out at the moonlit towers. She knew that the path ahead would demand courage, sacrifice, and unwavering loyalty. The bonds they had formed were fragile, yet strong, and the choices they would face could either save Eldrath or shatter it entirely. And in the quiet of the night, Seraphine understood that hearts could be both chains and wings, and that love, trust, and power were often inseparable. The coming days would test them all, forcing them to confront their fears, their desires, and the truth of who they were. The storm was coming, and there was no turning back. The sky above Eldrath was a tapestry of storm clouds and silver moonlight, shadows swirling over the high towers like restless spirits. The palace, once a place of golden halls and quiet whispers, now trembled under the weight of magic and destiny. Seraphine stood at the edge of the balcony, Kale at her side, the wind tugging at their cloaks. Below, the city's lights flickered as though the very stones themselves sensed the storm that was to come. Valerian emerged behind them, silent but imposing. His eyes, dark and stormy as the skies above, held a mixture of pride and concern. The father, the king, the man who had long carried the burden of his past, now faced a choice that would define not only his son's life but the fate of Eldrath itself. "You feel it too," Seraphine said softly, breaking the silence. "The power, the tension, it is everywhere." Valerian nodded, his expression unreadable. "I have always known it was coming," he said, "yet knowing does not make it easier." Kale looked up at them, a mixture of determination and fear in his gray eyes. I am ready," he said, though his voice trembled slightly. "I will face whatever comes, but I cannot do it alone." "You will not be alone," Seraphine said firmly, her hand brushing his. "We face this together no matter what." The palace trembled with a sudden surge of energy. Shadows stretched along the walls, twisting unnaturally, and the air seemed to thrum with anticipation. The magic Kale had struggled to control now surged freely, as though responding to a call only he could hear. Seraphine felt her heart quicken, aware of the delicate balance of power that now tied them all together. From the darkness, figures began to emerge, shapes cloaked in black, whispers of magic and menace surrounding them. The shadow forces that had haunted Eldrath for decades, stirred by the boy's power, had come to claim what they believed was theirs. Valerian stepped forward, the weight of his crown and the strength of his lineage pressing him into the forefront. "Stand behind me," he commanded, not just to Seraphine and Kale, but to the palace itself, as though the stones would rise to answer his call. Seraphine and Kale nodded, the bond between them now unbreakable. Together they stepped forward, their hands glowing with silver light, the energy flowing from Kale amplified and guided by Seraphine's careful control. The shadows recoiled slightly, sensing the power they faced. "Father, Kale began, unsure of the words to speak, the emotions swirling too fast for him to contain. Valerian looked at him, the storm in his eyes softening for a brief moment. "I know," he said quietly. "You are stronger than even I imagined, and I am proud of you." The words struck Seraphine with a quiet warmth. It was the first time she had seen the king, the man who had seemed untouchable, express pride in such a simple human way. She knew then that the bond between father and son, though complex and strained, had begun to heal. The first shadow stepped forward, its form twisting and shifting unnaturally. It raised a hand, a wave of darkness flowing outward, and Kale instinctively countered, his power flaring like a shield of silver light. Seraphine stepped beside him, guiding the flow, and together they formed a protective barrier, the shadows unable to penetrate the glow between them. Valerian moved to flank them, his own power and presence lending strength to the fragile shield. The three of them, bound by trust and purpose, became a force greater than the sum of their parts, and yet the shadows pressed closer, their whispers promising destruction, doubt, and despair. "Focus," Seraphine called, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. "Together." Kale nodded, taking a deep breath. The silver light from his hands expanded, flowing outward like a river, intertwining with Seraphine's energy. Valerian added his strength, his command over magic and experience shaping the torrent into a blade of brilliance that cut through the darkness. The shadows shrieked, twisting and writhing, but they could not break the unity formed by Father, Son, and Protector. And then, with a final surge, the darkness dissipated, retreating into the corners of the palace like smoke fleeing a fire. Silence fell, heavy and profound. Kale slumped to his knees, exhausted but alive. Seraphine caught him, holding him steady, feeling the warmth of his life pulse through her hands. "You did it," she whispered, tears of relief and pride welling in her eyes. Valerian knelt beside them, placing a hand on Kale's shoulder. "You did not just survive," he said softly. "You became what you were always meant to be." Kale looked up at his father, his gray eyes shining with something more than magic, something human, something that had grown in the crucible of struggle, trust, courage, and love. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for believing in me." The king's gaze shifted to Seraphine. For the first time there was no command, no distance, only acknowledgement. "And you," he said, voice low, "for guiding him when I could not. You have earned more than gratitude. You have earned my respect." Seraphine felt a quiet warmth, an unexpected ache that spoke to the depth of the bond they now shared. She had protected Kale, yes, but in doing so, she had become part of a story far greater than herself, a story of redemption, courage, and love. Days passed and the kingdom slowly recovered. Rumors of the events circulated, but the people of Eldrath were beginning to understand that Kale's power, guided by Seraphine's wisdom, could be a force for protection, not destruction. The nobles, once wary and suspicious, now watched with cautious respect. One morning, as the sun rose over the city, painting the towers in gold and amber, Seraphine walked through the gardens with Kale. The boy had grown stronger, his magic more controlled, and yet there was a quiet humility in him that made Seraphine proud. "Do you feel different?" she asked, smiling softly. Kale nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I feel whole," he said. "And I know I am not alone anymore. You, Father, you are both with me." Valerian appeared behind them, his presence solid and reassuring. "You have grown," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had once doubted himself. "Stronger than even I imagined. And you, Seraphine, have given him more than guidance. You have given him hope." Seraphine bowed her head slightly, feeling the deep warmth of the moment. "He gave me hope too," she said. "Hope that even the darkest shadows can be faced, and even the heaviest burdens can be shared." The three of them stood together, the first light of dawn illuminating their faces. The storm had passed, but its lessons lingered. That courage was born in struggle, that trust could be forged in fear, and that love, even in the quietest forms, could transform the hearts of kings, children, and protectors alike. Yet even in the calm, Seraphine knew the world of Eldrath was never simple. Magic would always stir, ambition would always threaten, and shadows would always linger in hidden corners. But now they faced the future together, bound by choice, trust, and the strength of their hearts. Kale stepped forward, looking up at Seraphine and Valerian. "I am ready," he said firmly, "to face whatever comes next, Not alone, never alone. Valerian placed a hand on his son's shoulder. And we will face it together, he said. You have not only survived Kale, but you have shown us all that redemption and courage are stronger than fear. Seraphine felt the surge of pride and relief that had been building for weeks. She looked at Kale, at the boy who had become a young man before her eyes, and at Valerian, the king whose heart had begun to soften through struggle and trust. The bonds between them were unbreakable now, forged in fire, shadow, and light. As the sun climbed higher, casting golden warmth across the palace, Seraphine allowed herself a quiet smile. The journey had been dangerous, the trials difficult, and the choices impossible at times. Yet here they stood together, stronger for everything they had faced. Kale reached out, taking her hand gently. "Thank you," he whispered, "for choosing me, for believing in me, for being with me." Seraphine squeezed his hand, feeling a quiet, unspoken truth settle in her heart. "Always," she replied. "No matter what comes, I will be with you." Valerian watched them, his eyes softening with a rare, almost human tenderness. "And I," he said quietly, "will stand with both of you. Whatever the world may bring, we face it as one." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the whispers of the past and the promise of the future. Eldrath had survived the storm, but more than that, it had been transformed by the courage, trust, and love of those who had faced the darkness together. The palace was still, bathed in sunlight, yet the air was alive with possibility. Seraphine, Kale, and Valerian understood that their journey was far from over. Challenges would come, shadows would return, and the threads of fate would continue to weave in ways they could not yet see. But for now, they stood together, bound by choice, love, and the unbreakable strength of their hearts. And in the quiet of that dawn, Seraphine realized that some promises, even those made in fear or duty, could be transformed into something far greater. Hope, redemption, and a future shaped not by shadows, but by the light they carried together. The kingdom of Eldrath had been tested, and it had endured. And so had they. The dawn stretched across the towers, golden and unbroken, carrying with it the whisper of new beginnings. The hearts that had once been bound by fear and duty were now free to choose, to love, and to face whatever darkness might come. And in that moment, Seraphine, Kale, and Valerian knew that no shadow, no curse, no power could ever sever the bond they had forged in fire, trust, and the quiet strength of hope. The story of their hearts, their struggles, and their redemption had only just begun, but together they were ready to face whatever came next.